with no further ado, so I'm going to get into kind of my presentation. So in general, actually, if developing a cure or a vaccine still takes a long time, and it results into extremely high costs. And so the big pharma companies around the world do not always have an actual, incentive to do so. The pharma industry and drug discovery scientists, they state that, whenever a disease is detected, kind of a new voyage into the chemical space commences. And what they're doing, actually, they're seeking for a medicine that potentially become, useful in containing the disease. So we're not talking about COVID-19, alone here. That's just true in general. And in general, actually, that process takes approximately 15 years and costs approximately $2.5 billion. And these are average numbers based on our conversations, basically, with the pharma industry. So the procedure basically starts with filtering millions of molecules to really identify the promising few hundreds that hopefully have a high potential to become a medicine. Well, there's a catch. Approximately 99% of the selected molecules, they actually fail later on in the process. And that's due to an inaccurate prediction behavior and a rather limited pool from which they were actually sampled. So even if you sample millions of molecules, that's actually not a whole lot. So the coronavirus actually is proving that the industry has to move much faster in really identifying and mitigating epidemics before they actually become pandemics. Because in today's, the global world we're living in, viruses just spread much faster, further, and more frequently than ever before. And one reason actually is that global travel these days is just something that is, taken for granted, as we have roughly 100,000 flights, taken off and land every day all over the globe. So if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that while our ability to identify and treat pandemics has improved greatly since the outbreak of, let's say the Spanish flu in 1918, there's still a lot of room for improvement. So over the past few decades, the pharma industry and scientists and numerous other fields such as AI have taken huge strides to improve quick detection capabilities. So I'll give you an example. It took a mere 12 days to map the outer spike protein of the COVID-19 virus using various new techniques and equipment, including AI. In the 1980s, a similar structural analysis for HIV took over 4 years. And I'm not a doctor, but I mean, if these numbers are even halfway true, so from the 1980s, actually 4 years, to 2020, 12 days, that's obviously a huge improvement. Many scientists actually, they state that one of the main issues with our current drug discovery process is that the development of pharmaceuticals is highly empirical. So molecules are actually made and then tested without being able to accurately predict the performance ahead of time. So the testing process itself is long, it's very cumbersome, and may not predict future complications that will surface only when the molecule actually is deployed at scale. And that further erodes basically the cost-benefit ratio right there. And while classical AI tools are already being developed and implemented to optimize certain processes, there's a limit to their efficiency at key tasks in that process. So ideally, a great way to cut down the time and cost would be to transfer the discovery and the testing from an expensive and time inefficient lab process to computer data centers. So if we had infinite compute power, we could simply scan these databases and calculate whether each molecule could serve as a cure or vaccine to, as an example, the COVID-19 virus. We would simply input all our factors into the simulation and screen the chemical space for a solution to the problem. Well, in principle, this is actually possible. After all, I mean, chemical structures, they can be measured. And the laws of physics, governing chemistry are basically known. The reality, though, is that we just do not have the computing power to solve the equations. And quite frankly, if we stick to classical computers, that includes all the high-praised HPC clusters, we never will. So while we actually simplify here, the fundamental problem of chemistry is to figure out where electrons reside inside a molecule and really calculate the total energy of such a configuration. With that data, you could actually calculate the properties of a molecule and predict its behavior. Accurate calculations of these properties will allow the screening of molecule databases for compounds that exhibit particle functions, such as drug molecule that is able to attach to the coronavirus spike and actually attack it. So essentially, if we could use a computer to accurately calculate the properties of a molecule and predict its behavior in a given situation, it would speed up the process of identifying a cure and improve its efficiency. So the million-dollar question actually now is if quantum computing will make a difference here, and if yes, why are quantum computers so much better suited than classical computers to simulate these molecules? Well, electrons actually spread out over a molecule in a strongly correlated fashion. And the characteristic of each electron depends deeply on those of its neighbors. So these quantum correlations, we label them entanglement, are at the heart of the quantum theory, and hence they basically make simulating electrons on a classical computer, even an HPC cluster, very, very tricky. So the electrons of the COVID-19 virus, as an example, have to be treated as being part of a single entity, having many degrees of freedom, and the description of this ensemble cannot be divided into the sum of the individual distinguishable electrons. In other words, we're dealing here with a quantum system. The electrons, because of their strong correlations, they have lost their individuality and so have to be treated as a unit. So to solve the equations, we have to consider all of the electrons simultaneously. And while classical computers theoretically could simulate, these molecules, every multi-electron configuration, and there are a lot, they would have to be stored separately in memory, and that's just not gonna happen. So I'll give you a little example here, okay? Let's assume we have a molecule with only 10 electrons, and let's forget about the rest of the atom right now. So each electron can be in two different positions within the molecule. Simplified, oversimplified, we labeled that either a spin up or a spin down. So essentially, we have 2 to the power of 10, which is 1,024 different configurations to keep track of, rather than just 10 electrons, which would have been the case if the electrons were individual, distinguishable entities. Again, they are not, as they form an actual quantum system. So we would need 1,024 classical bits to store the state of this molecule. Quantum computers, they use quantum bits, qubits, that are strongly correlated with one another in the same way as electrons are within molecules. So we only need 10 qubits to represent the strongly correlated electrons in this, makeshift model. So again, a 2-qubit quantum system provides 4 states, while a 2-bit classical system only provides 2 states. So with a 10-qubit quantum system, we have 1024 states, while a classical 10-bit system only provides 10 states. Long story short, the exponentially large parameter space of electron configurations in molecules is exactly the space that qubits naturally occupy. So qubits are naturally adapted to the simulation of quantum phenomena. The scaling difference between classical and quantum computation gets exceptionally large very, very quickly. Again, simulating penicillin, that's a molecule with 41 atoms and many more electrons, requires 10 to the power of 86 classical bits. I repeat, 10 to the power of 86 classical bits. That's more bits than the number of atoms in the entire universe. With a quantum computer, we would only need about 286 qubits, okay? So compare that, 10 to the power of 86 versus 286. The issue is that in 2021, no quantum gate system is available with that many stable qubits. The COVID-19 outer spike protein contains many thousands of atoms and is so completely intraceable for classical computation. The size of proteins makes them intraceable to classical simulation with any degree of accuracy, even on today's most powerful high-performance computing superclusters. Chemists, scientists, and pharma companies do simulate molecules on HPC supercomputers, but not as large as the proteins. But they have to resort to develop very rough molecule models that are just not capable of capturing the details that a full simulation requires. And so that simplified approach, again, it's necessitated by the classical compute systems that we have available today. That leads to rather large errors in the estimation process. The quantum computing industry is really making great progress in stabilizing the right now, rather fragile qubits, but nevertheless, it will take a while until a large enough quantum computer that's capable of simulating molecules as large as proteins will be available. But when such a computer will be available, that actually implies that we have a complete revolution in the way the pharma and the chemical industry operates. All right. Let's try to reiterate. To really appreciate where quantum technology can play a role, it's important to point out again where classical computing just falls short when it comes to simulating nature, okay? Most of physics and all of chemistry is based on what's labeled the Schrödinger equation that mathematically describes quantum waves, okay? Quantum waves basically are an artifact of quantum mechanics. A quantum entity behaves sometimes like a particle and sometimes like a quantum wave. It's not like an ocean wave. Nobody has ever seen a quantum wave. We use basically the Schrödinger equation to mathematically describe that quantum wave. The current state-of-the-art technology in computational chemistry is based on two approaches. First, either truncating that equation, or second, reformulating the problem to a simpler case, okay? With the first class of methods, you can actually achieve high precision, okay? But you have to really increase the computation time. However, problems easily get out of hand and only small systems can be simulated on classical systems. With this method, the simulation of the actual protein structure is totally out of reach. It would take way too long. The second class of methods is dominated by what's labeled the density function theory, density functional theory, DFT. With the density functional theory, the problem is simplified by considering the density of the electrons instead of the full electronic configuration. So you're oversimplifying at that point. You're only looking at the density of the electrons. And that works well for some systems, but starts to break down when the interaction of electrons really starts to increase. Unfortunately, for many interesting properties that are analyzed today, such as protein folding, DFT does not provide sufficient accuracy. That's where quantum computing comes in. Quantum phase estimation is a game changer for simulations of systems with lots of interaction among electrons. So by calculating the Schrödinger equation to a high accuracy, we can now determine the energy surface of the molecules. From the energy surface, we can learn about the chemical properties, such as the reaction rates and binding energies. A better understanding of the protein structure and the dynamics can so speed up the fabrication of vaccines. The holy grail here, basically end-to-end computer-based drug discovery, involves evaluating and breaking down the entire chemical structure of the virus and the cure. While larger quantum systems are becoming available, we will be able to do end-to-end computer-based drug discovery, as well as address the discovery of procedures to actually fabricate the drug. The objective is, down the road, it will take time, to move the entire process into a quantum computing-based simulation, allowing us to reach results at amazing speed. It's estimated by these scientists that these computer simulations could eliminate 99.9% of the false leads in a fraction of the time it takes today with the lab-based methods being used. It's estimated that with the appearance of a new epidemic, scientists could actually identify and develop a potential vaccine, a drug, in a matter of days. In that case, we're not done yet. The bottleneck for drug development would actually move from drug discovery to the human testing phases, including toxicity and other safety tests. Eventually, even these last stage tests could potentially be expedited by utilizing large-scale quantum computers. Today, in 2021, these tests are far out though, as at that level, it would be necessary to have access to a quantum computer with enough power to run a simulation of the entire human body, or at least part thereof. So that will screen candidate compounds and simulate their actual impact on the human body. But, to quote Richard Feynman, one of the, grandfathers of, quantum mechanics and the quantum electrodynamics field that he worked on, he said, nature is not classical, damn it. And if you want to make a simulation of nature, you'd better make it quantum mechanical. And by golly, it's a wonderful problem because it doesn't look so easy. So where are we actually in 2021, So how does an actual quantum computer really look like in 2021? Well, the actual implementation really varies from company to company. So trapped ion qubits were used to implement the first quantum logic gates in 1995. And the proposal for a quantum charge coupled device, it's a type of quantum computer with actions controlled by shoveling the ions around, was first made in 2002 by researchers at the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. They actually went on to win the 2012 Nobel Prize for Physics. So they use trapped ions. So what's an ion trapped? It's a combination of electric and magnetic fields that are used to capture charged particles. So an ion basically is a charged particle. So quantum gates have later been demonstrated in various platforms, ranging from Rydberg atoms to defects in diamonds. So in other words, actually on a quantum system, you may use atoms to calculate whatever your application is supposed to do. So we're using, quantum objects to do calculations. So a quantum computer is really suited to basically, simulate nature because we're using nature basically to do the simulation. A Rydberg atom actually is an atom with one or more electrons, and it forms in plasmas, okay? So the quantum computing technology of choice that was first used by quantum titans was solid state qubits. The titans are the Googles, the Amazons, the IBMs. Okay, in these systems, the qubits are superconducting circuits that can be mounted directly onto a chip. And that technology rapidly topped the benchmark set by trapped ions. And again, they are used these days in quantum systems from IBM and Google. So they use superconductors basically, you know, so they're cooling down these qubits to almost, you know, absolute zero. But, and that shows you how the whole industry is in a kind of a state of flux. You know, recently, progress made by utilizing these superconducting circuits, they appear to be slowing down as quantum computers integrate more and more qubits. The issue is to interact properly, the qubits, they have to be the same. And whereas two copies of the same ion are guaranteed by quantum mechanics to be actually identical, fabricating identical circuits, that's really in the vicinity of being impossible. So fabrication directly onto a chip places superconducting circuits in a thermal equilibrium with the chip. Okay, so if you develop a superconducting qubit-based quantum computer, you again have to cool that system down close to absolute zero. And that approach works okay with maybe a couple thousand qubits, but that will be truly challenging while really scaling the number of qubits. So some companies have recently shown interest in the trapped ion platform again, among them Honeywell, okay, that in 2020, they formed Honeywell Quantum Systems to really focus exclusively on the ion technology again. Another company that I want to introduce here today is actually called Xanadu. It's a startup. The quantum computing field is layered with startups, okay? So we're not just talking the heavy hitters, the Amazons, the Googles, the IBMs. There are a lot of startups like the Rigettis, the Cold Quantums, the Xanadus, our own company, Data Analytica, you know, we're more on the software side, but a lot of these companies are doing incredible work actually on, you know, the hardware side. So Xanadu is actually developing photonic chips for quantum computers. In other words, actually, they don't use, you know, atoms or ions to do the computations. They use photons. Photons, basically, that's a light particle, okay? It's electromagnetic radiation, basically. So they use light to do calculations. And they label their chips the X series. And they are made out of silicon and silicon nitride. Silicon nitride, that's a compound of nitrogen. And they basically consist of three primary modules, okay? We have the squeezers, that's the input to the computer. We have an interferometer, basically that's the logic gates. And then third, we have the photon detectors. That's basically the measurement output. So how it works. So classical laser light is first distributed to an array of squeezers. And these microscopic devices are made of small ring resonators that when driven by bright classical laser pulses, they generate a special quantum state of light that's labeled as a squeeze state. And that's Xanadu's version of a qubit. So for Xanadu, the qubit basically is light. These states involve a quantum superposition of different numbers of photons, okay? And once generated, they are actually coupled into an array of bus waveguides that carry them to the next stage. The squeezed states now enter a network of beam splitters and phase shifters, and that's called the interferometer. Again, we're talking about beam splitters and phase shifters, okay? And that's the interferometer. It sounds like sci-fi, but it's working in 2021. To program the interferometer, the user's instructions are loaded into the chip electronically. The control system then translates these instructions into a set of electrical voltages, and they are applied to the different compounds of the chip. The squeezed states, they interact with one another and they are entangled, okay? Again, that's a prerequisite for quantum computing. The interferometer can kind of be thought of as a sequence of quantum gates, and they're acting on the inputs. In general, the output of the interferometer is highly entangled quantum state that's encoding the processed quantum information. The quantum state is now ready for readout. So each output of the chip is directed to a special photon detector that's called a transition edge sensor. These detectors, they count how many photons are present in each output, and that yields an array of integers that are reported back to the user. So the results of the computation or algorithms are encoded in the statistics of this photon data. So the Xanadu quantum computing solution, is useful for solving complex problems in the domain of graph theory, okay? And graph theory is relevant to industries such as finance, chemistry, or logistics related problems. The short talk that we actually had today really shows that the state of quantum computing technologies is definitely in a state of flux. There's no clear winner yet on what technology will ultimately prevail while scaling the number of qubits. Nevertheless, quantum computers are available in 2021, and they're already used to solve complex real-world problems that are either difficult or impossible to solve on classical computers. So this slide basically shows you where we're at. In 2021, we're in NISQ, okay? That's the noisy intermediate scale quantum computing. So we have systems, with a little bit more than 100 qubits, but they're not as stable yet to really run long-running applications. IBM announced that in 2023, they will come out with a quantum system that will have 1,023 qubits. We're less than 18 months away from that. How stable that system will be, well, we'll have to figure it out. But we were told that that one actually will be stable enough to run longer algorithms, okay, which again gives the drug discovery process a boost. And hopefully within the next, few years, we have a system that we basically allow us to do a more expedited, journey into the drug discovery. The question I normally get is quantum computing going to replace classical computing? No, it will not replace classical computing. It will basically be a hybrid. Not every problem actually can be solved more efficiently on a quantum system. There are a lot of problems where a classical computer actually is the right solution. So within the next few years, what we will see basically is a hybrid ecosystem where we utilize quantum as well as classical computing to address some of the toughest problems that we're facing right now in 2021. All right, thank you very much for your time.